If I asked you, do you believe you have to suffer to deserve money? You'd probably say no. But let me ask you something else. Why do you feel a flicker of guilt when money comes to you easily? Why do you quietly distrust the opportunity that costs you nothing? Why do you secretly admire the exhausted more than the at peace? Clara owned a small bookstore. She unlocked the door before sunrise and locked it long after the street had gone quiet. She never said no to a customer, never took the day off, never let herself rest, because somewhere, without ever choosing it, she had come to believe one thing: that her exhaustion was proof she was doing it right. She didn't know she was carrying something heavy. She only knew her shoulders ached every single night. Florence Scovel Shinn understood a truth that would have seemed impossible to a woman like Clara, the lie so many of us live by, without ever once saying it out loud. Clara didn't think of herself as someone who believed in a lie. If you had sat her down and asked her directly, she would have laughed. She wasn't superstitious. She wasn't naive. She had read the books, she had said the affirmations, she had even once or twice closed her eyes at night and tried to imagine money flowing to her the way the teacher said it would. But imagining it never felt as real as the ache in her lower back by closing time. Because beneath the words she said out loud, there was a second voice, quieter, older, more convincing than any affirmation. That voice didn't speak in sentences, spoke in feelings. A tightening in her chest when a slow Tuesday meant no customers walked in. A flush of shame when she thought about closing early. Just once, just to rest. A strange comfort in comparing her exhaustion to someone else's. The relief of thinking, at least I'm not lazy, at least I'm trying hard enough. That relief. That's where the lie lives. Not in what we say we believe. In what makes us feel safe. If you run your own business, you know this feeling intimately, even if you've never given it a name. The client who says they'll pay by Friday, and Friday comes, and you check your phone one more time than you'd like to admit. The quiet math you do in your head before payroll. Will there be enough? Will there always be enough? The years you told yourself that once things got easier, you'd finally slow down. And the strange way things never quite got easier, because some part of you didn't fully trust ease. Maybe you're not a bookstore owner. Maybe you're a therapist, sitting with your own worry between sessions, wondering if the empty slot on Thursday means something is wrong with you. Maybe you're an agent, watching a deal stall and assuming it means you didn't work hard enough to close it. Maybe you're the one who does hair or takes photographs or teaches piano in the afternoons. And somewhere in the giving, you stopped noticing that you never once let yourself receive without first earning it in exhaustion. This is the part almost no one says out loud because it sounds absurd when you say it plainly. Some of us are quietly afraid of ease. Not because we don't want it. We want it desperately. But because ease feels unfamiliar, and unfamiliar feels unsafe. And somewhere along the way we started confusing safety with struggle. Clara would have told you she wanted rest. She would have meant it. And yet every time a slow week came, every time the shop was quiet and the phone didn't ring and there was, for once, nothing urgent demanding her hands, she felt something close to panic. Not relief. Panic. As if quiet meant something was about to go wrong. As if peace were the calm before a storm, rather than simply peace. She didn't know where this feeling came from. She only knew it had been with her a long time. Long before the bookstore, long before the loans, long before the late nights at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold. It had been there since she was young enough to watch someone she loved work themselves thin, and quietly absorb the lesson that struggle was what good, worthy people did. No one ever said it to her directly. No one had to. She watched and learned and carried it forward, the way we all carry things we were never handed on purpose. And here is what makes this lie so dangerous. It doesn't sound like a lie. Sounds like virtue. It dresses itself up as diligence, as the honest hard work any respectable person should be proud of. It never announces itself as a belief you could question. It simply becomes the water you swim in, until struggle and worthiness feel like the same word. Think for a moment about someone in your own life who taught you this without meaning to. A parent who equated rest with laziness. A grandmother who wore her tiredness like a badge, who said nothing good comes easy and meant it kindly, as protection. You didn't choose that lesson. You absorbed it the way children absorb everything, not through the words spoken, but through what was rewarded, what was praised, what earned a nod of approval. And so you grew into an adult who distrusts anything that comes without a fight. A compliment that felt too easy to believe. A sale that closed itself, with no struggle attached. A quiet afternoon with nothing urgent to do. And instead of resting in it, you invented tasks, just so the stillness wouldn't feel like falling behind. Clara carried something on her back she had never once set down long enough to examine. She thought it was simply the weight of running a business. She didn't yet know it had a shape, or that it had been built, piece by piece, out of every belief she had picked up and never questioned. But they were never the same word, struggle and worthiness. Not to the woman who first taught a very different way of living, decades before Clara was ever born. Nothing in Florence Scovel Shinn's writings suggests that prosperity meant giving up action. That is the part people miss when they hear about her for the first time and assume she is telling them to sit back and wait for miracles to fall into their laps. That isn't how her teachings are best understood. Her words carry the steadiness of someone who understood hardship up close. The kind of hardship that asks a great deal of a person, the kind that teaches women in particular to carry weight no one applauds. Nothing in her work suggests she was naive about effort. What she refused to accept was the idea that effort had to hurt in order to count. That distinction is small on the page and enormous in a life. Because what she taught, in that plain, almost blunt voice of hers, was this: the universe does not owe you more for how much you suffered to earn it. Grace is not a reward for exhaustion. It is not rationed out according to how tired you look when you finally receive it. She wrote about a law that felt almost scandalous to the women who first read her. A law that said the things you want are already moving toward you, and your job is not to force that motion through sheer will. Your job is to stop blocking it. Stop blocking it. Not work harder to deserve it. Not prove yourself worthy through one more sleepless night. Stop blocking what was already in motion. Clara had never heard it phrased this way. If someone had told her plainly that her constant striving might be the very thing standing between her and the ease she wanted, she would have felt something close to offense. Because striving was the only language she knew for care. Striving was how she loved her business, how she loved her customers, how, in some buried way, she had learned to love herself. Through proof, through output, through visible, exhausting effort. But there is a difference between action and struggle, even though they wear the same clothes. Action moves toward something. Struggle moves against an invisible resistance that was never really there. A resistance made entirely of fear, dressed up as diligence. Action can be full and demanding and still leave you steady at the end of the day. Struggle leaves you depleted even when the day went well, because the depletion was never really about the work. It was about a belief operating underneath the work, whispering that you had to bleed a little to earn what came to you. Shinn observed something in the people who came to her for help, something she wrote about with the calm certainty of someone who had watched it happen again and again. The ones who received easily were not the ones who worked the least. They were the ones who had simply stopped believing that ease was something to be suspicious of. They had let go of the quiet conviction that comfort was a debt waiting to be collected. Picture for a moment two women running the exact same kind of business. Same hours, same city, same economy pressing down on both of them equally. One of them treats every slow week as a verdict, proof that she isn't doing enough, proof that she needs to push harder, stay later, worry more. The other treats a slow week as simply a week, nothing more, nothing to defend herself against. Not because she's careless, not because she doesn't care whether the bills get paid, but because somewhere along the way, she stopped needing suffering as evidence of her own devotion. Which one of them do you think sleeps at night without the phone glowing on the nightstand at 2 a.m? Which one of them do you think money finds easier to reach? Notice, too, what happens in your own body when something good arrives without a fight. Client pays early, unprompted. A referral shows up out of nowhere, no pitch, no chasing. For a certain kind of woman, The first reaction isn't joy. It's suspicion. What's the catch? What am I going to owe for this later? As if goodness required a receipt. As if ease always came with fine print attached. That reflex isn't caution. It's the old lie, still fluent, still speaking in your body long after your mind stopped agreeing with it out loud. This is not about pretending problems don't exist. Shinn was far too practical for that kind of thinking, and so, frankly, are you. It is about noticing the difference between solving a problem and punishing yourself for having one. Between taking clear, grounded action and taking frantic, fear-driven action that only looks like productivity from the outside. Clara didn't know yet that there was a difference. She only knew the ache in her back, and the second voice that told her the ache was proof she was doing something right. She was about to learn otherwise. Not from a lecture, not from a book she forced herself to finish out of obligation, but from something far smaller. Something she nearly missed entirely, tucked away in a box she hadn't opened in years. Let me ask you something, and I want you to actually sit with it instead of answering too quickly. When was the last time you let yourself rest without earning it first? Not a vacation you'd been saving for months to justify. Not a night off you'd already worked yourself into the ground to deserve. Just rest, offered to yourself the way you'd offer it to someone you loved. For no reason except that you were tired, and tired is reason enough. If you're struggling to remember, you're not alone. Most of the women who watch videos like this one carry the exact same quiet math in the back of their minds, even if they've never said it out loud. Rest has to be earned. Ease has to be justified. Anything good that shows up uninvited gets met with suspicion before it gets met with gratitude. Think about how you respond when a slow month comes. Not what you say to your family, not what you post, but what actually happens in your chest when the calendar looks a little emptier than you'd like. Is there a small, cold drop of fear? The sense that emptiness means failure, that quiet means you're falling behind everyone else who is, presumably, working harder than you are right now? Or can you let a slow month simply be a season, the way a field lies fallow before it grows again, without turning it into a verdict on your worth? Most of us can't. Not yet. Because somewhere along the way we learn to read our own exhaustion as a kind of currency, proof to show, if anyone asked, that we were trying hard enough to deserve what we had. Here's a question that tends to land harder than people expect it to. When something good happens to someone else with what looks like very little effort, a friend's business takes off, a stranger online seems to have money flow to them without visible struggle, what's the first thing you feel? Be honest. For a lot of us, underneath the polite happiness we perform, there's a flicker of something less generous. A quiet voice that says, must be nice, or they don't know what real work is, or that would never happen for me. That reaction isn't really about them. It's about a belief so deep we rarely see it directly. The belief that ease is only for other people, people who are somehow different from us, luckier, less responsible, less serious. But Shinn's work points to something gentler and, frankly, more freeing than any of that. Her writings suggest that ease was never reserved for a lucky few. It was simply available to whoever stopped bracing against it long enough to let it in. Bracing. That's the word for what so many of us are doing without realizing it. Bracing for the invoice that doesn't come through. Bracing for the client who ghosts. Bracing for the moment good news turns out to have a catch attached. We walk through our days with our shoulders slightly raised, our jaw slightly tight, ready for the other shoe, because somewhere we decided that vigilance was the price of safety, and safety was the most we could reasonably hope for. You can carry that bracing for years without ever calling it by name. You just know your shoulders ache by the end of the day. You just know that even good weeks leave you tired in a way rest doesn't seem to touch. You just know there's a weight there, somewhere, even though nothing you're doing right now should feel this heavy. Maybe it shows up as the way you triple-check an invoice before sending it, certain you've made some mistake, even when you haven't in years. Maybe it shows up as the guilt that creeps in when a client thanks you warmly and you deflect the compliment instead of simply receiving it. Maybe it shows up as the second job you took on, the one you didn't really need, because an empty afternoon felt more dangerous than an overfull one. None of these things look like a belief. They look like personality, like habit, like just who you are. But underneath every one of them is the same quiet sentence, repeated so many times it stopped sounding like a sentence at all. If it comes easily, it isn't real, and if it isn't earned through struggle, it won't last. Clara knew that weight better than she knew her own reflection. She had stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing a low hum in a room you've lived in for years. Present in every hour, felt in every ache, and yet somehow invisible, because it had simply always been there. She would find out, before this story was over, exactly where that weight had come from. And more importantly, she would find out that she had been the one carrying it the entire time. Not because anyone forced her to, but because no one had ever shown her she was allowed to set it down. There's a particular kind of tired that has nothing to do with hours worked. You can sleep 8 hours and still wake up carrying it. You can take a full weekend off and still feel it sitting on your chest Monday morning, patient, unmoved, waiting for you to pick it back up the way you always do. That tired isn't physical. It's the weight of a belief you've been hauling around so long you forgot it was ever separate from you. If you felt that, if some part of what I've described in the last few minutes landed somewhere true, somewhere you didn't expect it to, I'd genuinely like to know. Not because I need the validation, but because so many women watching this right now are carrying the exact same weight in silence, convinced they're the only ones. So if this is speaking to something real in your life, tell me in the comments. Just a word. Tired. Familiar. In. Sometimes reading that one word from a stranger is enough to make a woman feel less alone in a feeling she's carried for years without saying out loud. Because here is what almost no one tells you about this particular kind of weight. It doesn't look like suffering from the outside. It looks like competence. It looks like reliability, like someone others can count on, like a woman who simply gets things done. People praise you for it. They call you strong, dependable, a hard worker, someone with real grit. And every time they say it, the weight gets a little heavier because now it isn't just a private belief, it's a compliment you have to keep earning. Clara had built an entire identity out of that weight without ever meaning to. Reliable Clara. The one who opened early and stayed late. The one customers trusted because she never seemed to need anything for herself. If you had asked her whether she was proud of that reputation, she would have said yes without hesitation. And she would have meant it. But pride and exhaustion can live in the same body at the same time, each one convincing you the other one doesn't exist. Maybe you know that particular kind of pride. The one that comes from being the person everyone relies on, the friend who always shows up, the business owner who never misses a deadline, the one whose name comes up when someone needs help and needs it fast. Feels good being that person. Feels in some quiet way like proof that you matter. And that's exactly why the weight is so hard to set down. Because somewhere along the way, the weight and the worth became the same thing in your mind, so that letting go of one felt like letting go of the other. What she didn't know, what none of us know until something forces us to look, is that the weight she was carrying had a shape. It wasn't an abstract feeling. It was made of specific things, specific sentences she had picked up along the way and never once sat down to examine. Things she had been told or shown, or simply absorbed by watching the people she loved most. And here is the part of this story that I think matters more than anything else I could tell you. Those things were never actually hers to carry. They were handed to her, quietly, without malice, without anyone realizing what they were passing on, and she had simply never been given permission to put them down. You may be carrying something similar right now. A belief about money, about worth, about what you have to prove before you're allowed to rest, that was never really yours to begin with. Something inherited. Something absorbed so early you can't even remember a version of yourself without it. Maybe it came from a parent who equated struggle with love, who showed you affection through sacrifice rather than words, so that you grew up believing sacrifice was what love looked like. Maybe it came from a moment of real hardship, a year when there truly wasn't enough, when fear was a reasonable response, and you simply never told your nervous system that the hardship had passed. The good news, and I promise you there is good news coming, is that whatever was picked up can be set down. Not through more effort, not through gritting your teeth and trying harder to believe something different, but through the much gentler, much stranger process of simply seeing it clearly for the first time. Awareness, in this particular kind of change, does far more work than willpower ever could. That's exactly what happened to Clara. Not in a moment of collapse the way you might expect. In a moment of almost nothing at all. An ordinary afternoon, a box she almost didn't open, a photograph she nearly overlooked entirely. It was a Tuesday, the kind of slow Tuesday that used to fill her with quiet dread, when Clara finally cleared out the back storage room she'd been avoiding for years. Boxes of old inventory. Receipts no one would ever need again. A shelf that had collapsed sometime during the second year and never gotten fixed. Just shoved out of sight and forgotten. Near the bottom of the last box, underneath a stack of invoices gone yellow at the edges, she found a photograph she didn't remember taking. It was her, standing in front of the shop on opening day. The paint on the sign was still wet enough that you could see the shine of it in the light. Her hair was pulled back the same way it always was. Nothing about the photo was remarkable, except for one thing that stopped her cold, right there on the dusty floor of the storage room, still holding the shelf brace in her other hand. She was smiling. Not the smile she gave customers, practiced and warm and slightly tired underneath. A different smile. Loose, unguarded. The smile of someone who hadn't yet learned to brace for anything. Clara sat down on an overturned crate and looked at that photograph for a long time. She tried to remember what that woman had believed back then, before the loans and the slow winters and the years of teaching herself that rest was something you earned in arrears, if you earned it at all. And what she remembered slowly was that the woman in the photograph hadn't believed anything about struggle yet. She had simply opened a shop because she loved books, because she loved the particular quiet of a room full of them, because some part of her had trusted, without evidence, without proof, that this would work. Somewhere between that morning and this one, something had changed. Not the shop. Not even, really, the customers or the economy or the 100 practical difficulties that come with keeping a small business alive for years. What had changed was quieter than all of that, and much heavier. She had started to believe that the shop only survived because she suffered for it. That every slow month was a warning she had to punish herself into fixing. That the woman in the photograph, hopeful, light, unafraid, had been naive, and that naivety had needed to be corrected by exhaustion, 1 year at a time, until exhaustion simply became who she was. She thought suddenly and clearly of a phrase her grandmother used to say, the same one she'd repeated to herself 1,000 times without ever once questioning it. Nothing good comes easy. Her grandmother had meant it kindly. A warning meant to protect her, passed down the way most beliefs are passed down, not as an argument to examine, but as a fact too obvious to need one. Clara could still picture her grandmother's hands, cracked from decades of work, and the particular pride in her voice whenever she talked about how hard she'd worked for everything she had. As a child, Clara had absorbed that pride the way children absorb everything, not as information but as truth. If someone you loved that much believed struggle was the price of a good life, why would you ever think to question it? You wouldn't. You'd simply carry it forward, the way you carry your mother's laugh or your father's stubbornness, without ever choosing to. And sitting there on the crate, in a storage room that smelled like dust and old paper, Clara understood something for the first time in her adult life. She hadn't been building a business all these years. Not only that, she had also been building something else, quietly, invisibly, one belief at a time, carrying it on her back the way you carry something so familiar you forget it has weight at all. She thought of her shoulders, how they'd ached every night, for longer than she could remember. She had always assumed it was the work. The lifting, the standing, the long hours on her feet. But sitting there with the photograph still in her hand, she wondered, for the first time, if the ache had never really been about the work at all. It was such a small thought. It didn't feel like a revelation. It didn't arrive with any fanfare, any sudden clarity, any of the drama you'd expect from a moment that would end up changing everything. It simply arrived quietly, the way truth tends to, and sat there beside her on the crate, patient, waiting to be noticed. For the first time in longer than she could name, Clara didn't reach for the next task. She just sat there, holding a photograph of a woman she barely recognized anymore, and let herself wonder what it might feel like to smile like that again. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the photograph, propped now against the lamp on her nightstand, that loose, unguarded smile catching the light every time she rolled over. Somewhere close to midnight, still awake, she found herself imagining something strange. Not a memory, not quite a dream either. More like a picture her mind offered her, unasked. The way images sometimes arrive when you've finally stopped forcing yourself to think in straight lines. She imagined herself walking, the way she walked every day between the shop and her car, except in this picture she was carrying something on her back. A backpack, worn and overfull. The straps dug so deep into her shoulders they'd left permanent grooves. She had been wearing it so long in this picture, that she'd stopped noticing its weight the way you stop noticing the weight of your own name. And in the picture someone stopped her. Not a stranger. Something closer to her own quiet voice, the one she rarely listened to, the one that had been trying to get her attention for years underneath all the noise of running a business, paying people, keeping the lights on. That voice asked her a simple question. Who put this on you? And in the picture, she heard herself answer without thinking. It's always been with me. But that wasn't quite true, was it? Nothing is always with anyone. Everything we carry got picked up somewhere, by some version of us too young or too tired or too afraid to ask whether it belonged to us at all. In the picture, the voice asked her to set the backpack down. Just for a moment, just to see. And when she opened it, carefully, the way you open something you've carried so long you're almost afraid of what it might mean if it turns out to be empty, she found it wasn't empty at all. It was full of stones. Not treasure. Not tools she needed for the road ahead. Stones. Plain, heavy, ordinary stones. Each one picked up somewhere along the way and never once questioned. She could almost read them, the way you can sometimes read the shape of a thought before you have words for it. One stone that said clients only respect you if you sacrifice for them. One that said resting is the same thing as losing money. One that said if you're not exhausted, you're not trying hard enough. One, older and heavier than the rest, worn smooth from decades of handling, that simply said you have to earn the right to be at peace. None of them were true. That was the strange part. Not one of these stones had ever actually been required to keep the shop open, to keep her customers loyal, to keep the lights on and the rent paid. They had simply been there so long she'd mistaken their weight for necessity. If you paused this right now and looked inside your own backpack, what would you find? Maybe a stone that says asking for a fair price makes you greedy. Maybe one that says if you're not exhausted by Friday, you didn't work hard enough to deserve the weekend. Maybe one you picked up so early, from a parent, a first job, a hard year you never quite recovered from, that you've never once considered it might not belong to you. Most of us are carrying at least one stone we never chose and have never once set down long enough to ask whether it was ever true. This is the part of the story I most want you to hear clearly, because it's the same discovery Florence Scovel Shinn's writings point to again and again, in different words across different pages. The things we suffer for are so rarely the things that actually keep us safe. Most of what we carry isn't holding us up. It's simply holding us down, disguised so well as responsibility that we forget to ask whether it was ever load-bearing at all. Clara sat with that image for a long time before she finally fell asleep. Not fixed, not transformed overnight, the way these stories sometimes get told when someone wants to wrap things up quickly and move on. Just quieter, just a little less certain that the ache in her shoulders was something she had to keep earning. There is a particular kind of relief that comes from realizing a weight was never required, even before you've figured out how to set it down. It doesn't fix anything yet. The bills are still due. The shop still opens at the same hour tomorrow. But something loosens anyway. Some small space opens up between who you are and what you've been carrying, and in that space, for the first time in longer than you can remember, you can breathe just slightly deeper. Somewhere in the dark, before sleep finally took her, she thought of one more thing. Small, almost embarrassingly simple, but it stayed with her all the same. If the stones weren't required, then maybe the backpack had never needed to be that heavy to begin with. Maybe it never really needed to be carried at all. The next morning, Clara did something she had never done before in all her years of running the shop. She took a legal pad, the kind she usually reserved for inventory counts, and instead of numbers, she wrote down stones. Not abstractly, specifically. She sat at her kitchen table with her coffee going cold, the way it always did, and she made herself finish each sentence honestly, even the ones that stung a little to write down. "Clients only respect me if I sacrifice for them," she wrote. And underneath it, almost without meaning to, the truth surfaced. "My best customers have never once asked me to suffer. They've asked me to be reliable. Those aren't the same thing. Resting means I'm losing money," she wrote next. And then, slower. "The slowest month I ever had wasn't the month I rested. It was the month I was too exhausted to notice a good idea when it walked through the door. If I'm not exhausted, I'm not trying hard enough." She stared at that one longest, because underneath it was something she'd never said out loud to anyone, not even herself. Exhaustion had become proof. Proof that she cared, proof that she was a good business owner, proof that she deserved whatever good came her way. Without it, some part of her worried she'd have no evidence left that she was worthy of anything at all. "I have to earn the right to be at peace." The oldest stone. The one that had been there longest, worn smooth by decades of handling, going back further than the shop, further than her first job, back to a kitchen table that wasn't hers, watching someone she loved work herself thin and call it virtue. "This is the exercise I want to offer you now," the same one Clara stumbled into almost by accident. Not because writing things down is magic. It isn't. But because a belief loses a great deal of its power the moment you drag it into daylight and look at it plainly, instead of letting it operate quietly underneath everything you do. Take a moment sometime today and finish this sentence, more than once if you need to. "I believe I have to earn before I'm allowed to rest or receive or feel at peace." Write down whatever comes, even if it sounds strange on paper. Especially if it sounds strange on paper. That strangeness is usually the sound of a belief meeting daylight for the first time in years. Then, underneath it, ask yourself one honest question. Is this actually true? Not is it familiar? Not is it what everyone around you seems to believe? Is it true for you right now in the life you're actually living? Clara found that most of her stones didn't survive that question. Not because she argued herself out of them. Simply because, once she looked directly at them, they had nowhere left to hide. There's a second part to this practice, gentler than the first, and Clara did this too without quite realizing what she was doing. Before bed that night, she thought back over her day and tried to name 3 things that had come to her easily. Not earned through struggle, not fought for, simply received. A customer who paid the moment the invoice went out, no reminder needed. A regular who stopped by just to say the shop had gotten her through a hard year. A parking spot right outside the door on a street where that never happened. Small things. Almost embarrassingly small. But each one was proof, if she let it be, that ease was already moving through her life in places she'd simply stopped noticing, because she'd trained herself for so long to notice only the struggle. That's often how grace actually moves, if you pay attention. Not in grand, dramatic arrivals, but in small, easily overlooked moments we've been conditioned to dismiss as luck, or coincidence, or simply not worth mentioning. A green light when you were running late. A friend who called at the exact moment you needed to hear a familiar voice. An idea that arrived fully formed, with none of the usual wrestling. We've been trained to trust the struggle and doubt the ease, when the truth may be closer to the opposite. Try that tonight if you're willing. 3 things that came to you without a fight. Say them out loud if you can, even quietly, even just to the empty room. The nervous system believes what it hears repeated, and for years most of us have only ever repeated the difficulty out loud, never the ease. And if you want a single sentence to carry with you, the way you might carry a stone in the opposite direction, something to set down instead of pick up, try this one, the same words Clara found herself whispering before she finally fell asleep that night. I receive by grace, not by struggle. Say it now if you like. Not as a performance. Just as an experiment to see how it feels in a body that has spent years believing the opposite. Nothing dramatic happened to Clara's business in the weeks that followed. No sudden windfall. No line out the door. If you had walked past the shop that month, you wouldn't have noticed a single visible difference. But something had shifted underneath, in a place no customer could see. And that shift began to show itself in small, quiet ways. She started closing on time. Not because business demanded it, but because she'd stopped needing to prove something by staying later than necessary. The first few evenings felt strange, almost wrong, like she was getting away with something she hadn't earned. But she kept doing it anyway, and slowly, the wrongness faded into something closer to relief. She caught herself one Tuesday afternoon, in the middle of inventing a task to fill a quiet hour, and instead of finishing it, she stopped. She noticed what she was doing, filling the silence because silence had always felt like danger. And instead of reaching for one more thing to prove her worth, she sat behind the counter with a cup of tea and simply let the quiet be quiet. Nothing bad happened. That, more than anything else, was the revelation. The shop didn't fall apart because she stopped bracing for it to. The customers who mattered kept coming back, not because she suffered more for their loyalty, but because she had always been good at what she did, suffering or not. There was a slow Thursday, not long after, when a customer she didn't recognize paid full price for a stack of books without so much as glancing at the total, then left a tip in the jar by the register on her way out. Something that had never once happened before, not in all her years running the shop. Clara felt the old suspicion rise up first. Quick and familiar. What's the catch? And then, just as quickly, she felt something else rise up behind it. Nothing. Maybe there simply wasn't a catch. Maybe good things were allowed to arrive exactly as easily as they seemed to. This is the part of Shinn's writings that so many people skip past, because it doesn't sound dramatic enough to be a teaching. Non-resistance. Not passivity. Not giving up. Simply the willingness to stop fighting a current that was never actually working against you in the first place. Her work suggests again and again that so much of what we call effort is really just resistance dressed up in the clothes of hard work, pushing against a door that was already open, bracing for a storm that had already passed. Clara began to notice how much energy she'd spent, for years, resisting things that were never actually threats. Resisting rest, as though rest were the enemy of a thriving business. Resisting ease, as though ease meant she'd stopped caring. Resisting the plain, simple fact that she was allowed to receive good things without first proving, through exhaustion, that she deserved them. None of this means the practical parts of running a business disappeared. She still opened the shop most mornings. She still balanced the books, still ordered inventory, still had the occasional hard month where the math didn't quite work out the way she'd hoped. Florence Scovel Shinn never promised a life without effort. What her writings point toward instead is a different relationship with effort altogether. One where you can work fully, care deeply, show up completely, without needing exhaustion as proof that any of it counted. A few months later, a regular customer, someone who'd been coming into the shop for years, told Clara something that stayed with her long after the woman had left with her books. "You seem lighter lately," she said. "I don't know what changed, but I like it." Clara didn't explain the backpack, or the stones, or the photograph still propped against her lamp at home. She just smiled, the loose, unguarded smile from that old photograph, the one she'd almost forgotten she was capable of, and said thank you and meant it. If you've been carrying something similar, some belief you inherited so long ago you forgot it was ever separate from you, I want you to hear this clearly. You don't have to fix it all at once. You don't have to prove, through some dramatic transformation, that you've truly let it go. You simply have to notice it, name it, and set it down a little more each day than you picked it back up. That's not failure. That's exactly how change like this actually happens. Not in a single decisive moment, but in 100 small ones. Each time you choose ease over bracing, rest over proving, grace over struggle. The weight you've been carrying was never load-bearing. It never held up your worth, your business, or your life. You were always capable of walking without it. You simply hadn't yet been shown that you were allowed to try. Before we get to where Clara's story really lands, I want to pause here for a moment because I think some of you needed this video more than you expected to when you clicked on it. Maybe you came here curious about a phrase in the title, a little skeptical, the way any reasonable person is skeptical of a promise that sounds too neat. And somewhere along the way, maybe at the photograph, maybe at the backpack, maybe earlier, at the question about what happens in your chest when a slow month arrives, something in this video found you. Not the whole video. One sentence, probably. One image that landed somewhere you didn't expect it to. If that happened, I'd love to know which part it was. Not for me. For the woman scrolling through these comments later tonight, unable to sleep, wondering if anyone else feels the way she does. Tell her. Tell her which stone was hers. Was it the belief that rest has to be earned? Was it the guilt that shows up when something good comes easily? Was it the exhaustion you've been quietly proud of, without ever saying that out loud until right now? Whatever it was, write it down in the comments. Someone reading it tonight needs exactly those words, in exactly your voice, more than they need anything I could say up here. There's something that happens in a comment section like this one that doesn't happen almost anywhere else in a woman's life. A stranger writes down the thing she's never said out loud, and another stranger reads it and thinks, "That's me too," and for a moment, neither of them feels quite so alone in it. That's not a small thing. That's most of the reason I make these videos at all. And while you're there, tell me something else if you're willing. What's the lie you'd want unpacked next? The most dangerous prayer you keep repeating without noticing what it's actually asking for. The most dangerous habit quietly blocking the prosperity you say you want. There's a whole series forming around this idea, one dangerous belief at a time, and I'd rather build it around what's actually keeping you up at night than around what I assume it might be. So tell me. I read every single comment, and more of these videos get made because of what you tell me you're still carrying. There's one more thing I want to ask of you, and I promise it's the last one. Think of someone in your life right now who carries a backpack like Clara's. Someone who works too hard and rests too little, and quietly mistakes their own exhaustion for virtue. A sister who's building something on her own and won't slow down long enough to notice she's allowed to. A friend who apologizes every time she takes a day off. A daughter maybe already learning the same lesson you spent years unlearning. You don't have to explain this video to her. You don't have to make it a whole conversation, or turn it into advice she didn't ask for. Just send it to her. Just say, "This made me think of you." Let her find her own way into it, the way you found your way into it tonight. Sometimes the kindest thing you can hand someone isn't advice at all. It's simply permission. The quiet suggestion that maybe the weight she's been carrying was never actually required. You might not know right away whether it landed. She might not text back tonight or even this week. That's all right. Permission has a way of working slowly, quietly, in the background of a life, long after the moment it was given. You may never know exactly which sentence was the one that finally let her set something down. But you'll have been the one who sent it to her, at the exact moment she needed it, even if neither of you realizes that until much later. That's really what this whole video has been about, if I'm honest with you. Not a technique. Not a decree to repeat until you believe it. Just permission. Permission to set something down that you were never actually required to carry in the first place. So if this found you tonight, in whatever quiet corner of your evening you're watching this from, know that it wasn't an accident. And before we close, let this be the start of something rather than the end of it. Leave your stone in the comments, ask for the video you need next, and send this to the one person who's still carrying a weight she doesn't know she's allowed to put down. There's a little more of Clara's story left, and I think you're going to want to hear how it ends. Almost a year later, Clara found herself back in that same storage room, clearing out space for a reading corner she'd been wanting to build for years but had never quite let herself justify. Not because it would make money, simply because it would make the shop feel more like what she'd always imagined it could be. A place people wanted to stay in, not just pass through. She found the box again. The one with the photograph. Except this time, she wasn't looking for it. She'd simply reached for an old ledger and found it tucked beside the ledger instead. Exactly where she'd left it after that first Tuesday. Still holding the same shine of wet paint, the same unguarded smile. She held it up next to her reflection in the dusty window glass. The two women looked, for the first time in a very long time, almost the same. Not identical. She was older now, and the shop had changed, and there were still slow weeks, still invoices she checked more than once, still the occasional night where an old stone tried to work its way back into the bag out of pure habit. Old beliefs rarely leave all at once. They tend to circle back, quieter each time, testing whether the door is still open before they finally stop trying it at all. But the difference was there, plain as daylight if you knew what you were looking for. The tightness around her eyes was gone. The particular tension she used to carry in her shoulders, the one she'd mistaken for the cost of doing business, had loosened into something closer to ease. Not because the business had become easier, but because she'd stopped requiring it to hurt in order to trust that it was real. She thought, standing there in the storage room with the photograph still in her hand, about all the years she'd spent believing that struggle was the receipt she had to keep, proof to show anyone who asked that she'd truly earned what she had. She thought about how much of that struggle had never actually built anything. It had simply been weight, carried out of habit, mistaken for necessity because no one had ever shown her it was allowed to be set down. And she thought, too, about how quietly it had all changed. No lightning. No single dramatic morning where everything shifted at once. Just a photograph. A question she let herself sit with instead of rushing past. A backpack she imagined and opened, and finally understood didn't need to be carried the way she'd been carrying it. A handful of small choices, repeated often enough, until one day the woman in the mirror and the woman in the photograph were close enough to recognize each other again. If you've made it this far, I suspect some part of this story found something true in you too. Maybe you're not a bookstore owner. Maybe your business looks nothing like Clara's, or maybe you don't run a business at all. But I'd guess, if you're honest, that somewhere in you there's a backpack you've been carrying so long you stopped feeling its weight. A stone or two you picked up from someone you loved, who meant well, who was only ever trying to protect you the only way they knew how. Maybe your stone came from a mother who never once sat down. Maybe it came from a marriage that taught you love had to be earned through usefulness. Maybe it came from nowhere you can name it all. Just a slow accumulation of small moments where struggle got praised and ease went quietly unnoticed, until the pattern became so familiar it stopped looking like a pattern and started looking like just who you are. However it arrived, it can leave the same way it came. Quietly, gradually, one honest look at a time. You don't have to set it all down tonight. You don't have to prove that this video changed you, the way we sometimes feel pressure to prove that anything meaningful worked. You simply have to know now that it's allowed. That the ache in your shoulders was never the price of a good life. That the things worth having were never actually waiting on your exhaustion to arrive. Florence Scovel Shinn's writings point, again and again, toward the same quiet truth Clara found in that storage room. Grace was never something you had to bleed for. It was already moving toward you, patient, unhurried, waiting only for you to stop bracing long enough to let it in. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight, and with Clara, and with whatever quiet weight you brought here with you. I hope you leave a little lighter than you arrived. Take care of yourself this week, and I'll see you in the next one.